Welcome to today's explainer. I want you to think about this profound irony for just a second. Literally, a wrong turn by a driver in a regional city triggered a global catastrophe that ultimately destroyed four towering empires, completely redrew the map of the world, and changed the very nature of warfare forever. It's a staggering story of how an entire world order collapsed almost overnight.
Because, you see, this conflict fundamentally shifted humanity's understanding of battle. Before 1914, many people actually held on to this romanticized, almost glorious view of war. But, well, that illusion was about to be violently shattered. The world was plunging headfirst into a devastating, mechanized industrial reality where millions would never return home. And those who did, they came back to a world they barely recognized. Okay, let's dive into this. To understand a conflict of this incredible scale, here's our roadmap. We'll trace the European powder keg to the spark that ignited it, examine the grim reality of total war, expand our view to the global theaters of conflict, and finally, look at the flawed peace and the echoes it left behind.
Part 1. The European powder keg and decades of rivalry and tension.
In the summer of 1914, Europe was standing on the absolute edge of a catastrophe. The great powers were armed to the teeth, right? Germany was rising rapidly, Britain ruled with an unmatched navy, France was desperate for security, and older empires like Austria-Hungary were struggling to just maintain their grip. By 1914, Europe had organized itself into this incredibly fragile web. You had the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain positioned squarely against the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, this wasn't just a defensive pact, it was literally a continental tripwire. A localized dispute could essentially hijack the entire continent, rapidly pulling everyone into a massive, unstoppable war.
Part 2. The spark ignites and the domino effect of 1914.
The Balkans had become the most unstable part of Europe, and the spark that finally blew up the powder keg? It started in Sarajevo. On June 28th, a Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And that shockwave triggered an unstoppable chain reaction. Austria-Hungary issued an extreme ultimatum to Serbia. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany mobilized against Russia, and then France. And a massive terrifying factor here was the rigid nature of train timetables. Military planners had developed enormous mobilization plans based on absolute speed, meaning that once leaders pushed the go button, they literally couldn't stop the trains.
This intense fear of timing led to Germany's ultimate gamble, the Schlieffen Plan. The strategy was absolutely audacious: to bypass heavily defended borders, move rapidly through neutral Belgium to quickly crush France in the west, and then rush those troops east to face the slower mobilizing Russians before they were ready. But this plan had a fatal diplomatic consequence. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, and the second German boots crossed into Belgium, Britain instantly entered the war.
Part 3. The reality of total war and the industrial meat grinder.
So Germany's initial surge forward was finally halted near the Marne River in September 1914. Unable to capture Paris quickly, the Schlieffen Plan basically collapsed, and both sides desperately dug in. From the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border, soldiers constructed a sprawling nightmare of trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire. Millions of men had marched off in 1914 expecting a glorious, short war. Instead, generals trained for 19th-century cavalry charges repeatedly ordered massive frontal assaults against 20th-century machine guns. In symbolic battles like Verdun and the Somme, the fight was less about gaining ground and entirely about a brutal, exhausting struggle of endurance.
To sustain this unprecedented level of fighting, societies had to fundamentally change. Total war meant the battlefield completely swallowed the home front. I mean, whole economies were hijacked for destruction. Factories entirely switched to military production. Governments introduced strict rationing. And with millions of men bleeding at the front, women stepped into jobs in factories, transportation, and agriculture that have been traditionally dominated by men, bringing about significant, long-lasting social transformations. Even propaganda became a massive weapon in itself, absolutely essential to keeping civilian morale from collapsing.
Out on the battlefield, the horror was amplified by terrifying new industrial technologies. Machine guns made those frontal assaults practically suicidal. Artillery was fired in quantities that literally destroyed whole landscapes. Then came the true terrors, like poison gas causing horrific injuries, which made gas masks standard-issue gear just for survival. The first experimental tanks appeared, and sure, they were breaking down constantly, but they were utterly terrifying to enemy lines. Aircraft evolved from novelties to vital weapons.
while submarines fundamentally altered naval warfare forever.
But the cost wasn't just measured in body counts or physical wounds. The relentless, deafening barrage of artillery birthed a devastating new psychological horror: shell shock. Returning soldiers suffered profound, lasting psychological trauma, inflicted by the horrors of industrial warfare. Entire societies experienced grief on an unprecedented scale, as towns and villages carved the names of their lost generations into local stone memorials.
Part 4. A truly global conflict, moving beyond the Western Front.
Now, what's really interesting to look at here is the sheer global scale this represents. It's vital to remember this wasn't just a European war of trenches. Out on the highly mobile Eastern Front, German forces destroyed massive Russian armies at places like Tannenberg, yet Russia remained incredibly resilient. The Ottoman Empire's entry opened fronts in the Caucasus and Mesopotamia, leading to the fierce Gallipoli campaign. This theater also included a tragic chapter where authorities began mass deportations and killings of Armenians, events widely recognized by historians as genocide, though disputed by the Turkish government. The fighting consumed African colonies, it sparked the Arab revolt in the Middle East, and it stretched into the oceans with ruthless German U-boat attacks.
Then came 1917, a year that brought absolute whiplash to the strategic balance of the conflict. German leaders made a disastrous calculation by resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, which suddenly pulled the immense economic and industrial might of the United States into the war in April. But, right as the world's most powerful democracy was entering the fight, a starving, collapsing Russian empire was exiting. The Russian Revolution swept the Tsar from power, and by November, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized control, signing a peace treaty with Germany and leaving the war completely.
Part 5. The Flawed Peace and the Collapse of Empires.
With Russia out, Germany had one final, desperate chance in the spring of 1918. They launched a massive offensive on the Western Front, but it completely exhausted their forces. The Allies, now bolstered by fresh American troops and coordinated tactics, fiercely counterattacked. The Central Powers just began to shatter. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire surrendered, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire splintered. Germany itself was collapsing under military defeat, food shortages, and revolutionary unrest. It culminated in a singular historic alignment of numbers. On the 11th month, on the 11th day, at exactly 11 a.m. in 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice. The guns finally fell silent.
But peace would prove almost as complicated as war. The victorious Allies met in Paris, bringing vastly different agendas. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with a utopian vision of a new international order based on national self-determination. However, Britain and France wanted absolute security, and honestly, they wanted Germany punished. The resulting Treaty of Versailles was incredibly harsh. Germany lost territory, its military was crippled, and it was forced to pay massive reparations. Most humiliatingly, it had to accept a war guilt clause. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a psychological weapon that created deep, festering resentment within Germany that would backfire spectacularly.
The peace settlement also birthed the League of Nations, a noble dream to prevent future wars through international cooperation and collective security. But its foundation was instantly hollowed out. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty, meaning the U.S. never actually joined. The very organization designed to keep world peace was critically paralyzed from day one because it lacked one of the major global powers that had inspired its creation in the first place.
Part 6. Echoes of the Great War. The 20th Century's Blueprint.
So the crucial point is that 1914 violently destroyed the old world, and 1919 birthed the unstable new one. The Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires were gone. The maps of Eastern Europe and the Middle East were redrawn, often ignoring competing nationalist ambitions. Colonized peoples who had fought for these empires began demanding freedom, giving major momentum to anti-imperial movements. You see, the war didn't solve the 19th century's problems. It violently mutated them into the 20th century's horrors. Out of the trenches emerged revolution, extreme nationalism, the rise of fascism, the spread of communism, and the long struggle for decolonization.
Which leaves us with a haunting question. If this was supposed to be the war to end all wars, why did its flawed peace merely set the stage for an even greater catastrophe? The peace didn't eliminate the tension, it incubated it. Unresolved anger, deep national humiliation, isolation, and extreme economic crises provided incredibly fertile ground for extremism to grow. In Germany, a young movement led by Adolf Hitler would soon exploit this very resentment, setting the stage for World War II. The world of 1914 vanished, but its scars define us today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.